Here are the terms for this lecture. And then here are the learning objectives. By the end of this presentation, you should understand first how the Union and Confederacy created their armies, that is to say, military mobilization. Secondly, the Union and Confederate objectives in 1861 and 1862. Third, the Union and Confederate strategies, the grand strategies for achieving these objectives. And by grand strategy, I mean the coordinated use of all resources to achieve the objective. These would be diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Then the Lincoln administration's challenge, this is a really major challenge, in creating and maintaining political unity in the North and avoiding the alienation of the border states. These were absolutely key in terms of setting the conditions for an eventual Union victory. Then Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan and why Lincoln rejected it. Then the Union conciliatory policy towards Southern civilians and its failure. And then finally, the basics of the military campaigns of 1861 and 1862. I don't expect you to know about the campaigns and battles and so forth in detail, but I need for you to know the basic sort of muscle movements, as it were, the outlines of the major campaigns and why they occurred, what the outcome was, and what the consequences were of these major military campaigns in the first 2 years of the war. Now, this is the strategic situation at the war's outset, and you can see that this is as of the firing of Fort Sumter, or shortly afterward. You had the Deep South had already seceded. Then after Fort Sumter, you had the additional secession of the states of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, and also Arkansas. So you'll notice that there are 4 slave states that remain in the Union. These are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and then Delaware. And Delaware doesn't really figure very prominently, but there was still legal slavery in that state as well. But the key border states, as they're called, are Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. And the Lincoln administration believed that it absolutely had to prevent these 3 states, the 3 crucial border states, from joining the Confederacy. And they pursued different strategies by which to prevent this. Maryland was sort of held in within the Union through arbitrary arrests and military occupation and so forth. I'm not saying that Maryland would have seceded otherwise, but that's the way that the Lincoln administration went about it. With regard to Missouri and Kentucky, the idea was to take a softer approach to avoid alienating state governments of these two states, and then to gradually eliminate the Confederate presence in the border state areas. Now, notice the transportation net. These are essentially the railroads, but also, and this can tend to be lost, are the transportation net in terms of the navigable rivers that go into the American South. The Union would haul a lot of supplies during advances via railroad, but even more of its supplies were carried by the navigable rivers. And so the Confederates understood that they needed to protect these navigable rivers from Union advances, and the Northern armies had a major objective, military objective, in terms of seizing these navigable rivers. Now, in terms of mobilization, military mobilization, these consisted primarily of volunteers. The United States Army in 1861 numbered only 16,000 officers and men, and it was just completely unequal to the task of subduing the 11 Confederate states that had seceded. And so the Union turned primarily to volunteers to conduct its war effort. So did the Confederates. They created a small regular army, but they also depended very largely on volunteers. Now, the method of recruitment was first or an important community leader, a politician, a businessman, a sheriff, something along these kinds of lines, somebody well known to the community, would raise typically a company. A company in the Civil War era was 100 men, and then offer this company to the governor of a given state. The governor would then assemble these companies into a regiment. A regiment consisted of 10 companies totaling at the beginning of the war 1,000 officers and men, and then offer this regiment to their respective national governments. So in the North, the governors would offer the regiments to the United States government, which would then federalize them for military service. And in the Confederacy, of course, the governors would offer their regiments to the Confederate states government. Now, there's an important interplay between politics and the military, which plays out really most crucially in the northern states, because as we're going to see in greater detail in a moment, the Lincoln administration faced a really critical task in terms of maintaining political unity in the North, in terms of defeating the incipient Confederate States of America. After the fight, after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Northern sentiment for defeating the Confederacy through military action was really very high. But the Lincoln administration knew that this initial support could be lost quite quickly if the Lincoln administration was not careful to preserve it. And so a phenomenon called political generals was really very common, and there are two of them shown in the photographs to the right. One of them is Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler, who really had very little military experience of any kind. He had been an officer in the Massachusetts militia, but he was basically a prominent Massachusetts politician. And then next to him is another New Englander, Nathaniel Prentice Banks, who also became a major general. Banks had no previous military experience of any kind. He had been the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives a bit before the war. Why on earth would Lincoln make these two men and others like them important generals? Major general is the top tier of Union generals for much of the war. Why would Lincoln do this? Well, in military terms, these political generals, as they were called, were not very good at all, and both Butler and Banks would be associated with military disasters during the course of the conflict. But, and this is an important but, in terms of understanding the politics of the Civil War, and in terms of understanding how to exert political influence as well as military influence over the Confederate regions that came under their control, the political generals were really very important. And both Butler and Banks would prove crucial to the Lincoln administration when the Lincoln administration eventually adopted a policy of emancipation, because the professional generals had no idea how to deal with this new reality, how to implement emancipation. But the political generals did, prominently Butler and Banks. Now, to continue with military mobilization, motivation is important here. Remember that there are three kinds of motivation: enlistment motivation, sustaining motivation, combat motivation. Now, combat motivation is mostly about the standing shoulder to shoulder with one's comrades. Teamwork is very important. Concern for one's comrades is really very important. A desire to avoid seeming like a coward is very important in combat. Sustaining motivation, of course, has to do with what motivates soldiers to remain in the Army once they're dealing with the sight of deaths and wounds and deaths from disease and so forth. But we're going to be dealing here with enlistment motivation. What is the thing that motivated soldiers in the North and in the South to volunteer to join the Union and Confederate armies in such great numbers? Well, one factor is the defense of homeland, and this is important mainly to Confederate generals. There was also really a desire for adventure. The idea of seeing the elephant, of participating in battle, had a certain romantic appeal, and also as a way to test one's manhood. But what's really important with the American Civil War is the defense of principles. Union and Confederate soldiers were really much more ideologically aware than we used to believe. And so in the North, the principle involved, the political principle involved, was, as one Union soldier called it, the best government on God's footstool. So we wanted to preserve this best government on God's footstool, to preserve Republican small r government, which this time, republics were a rarity on the world stage. You're dealing mostly with monarchies and other kinds of top-down governments. And so Northern soldiers saw the war quite rightly as a test to see whether a republic could survive or not. In the South, there was what a Confederate soldier called the holy cause of liberty and independence. And liberty seems like kind of an odd thing to be fighting for when a major goal of the Confederate government is the preservation of slavery. But what they really meant was, was the cause of liberty in terms of common white Southerners, to preserve their position in Confederate society. The sense was that only with what we called a mudsill of enslaved Africans was it possible for whites to enjoy enough equality that they would all have liberty together, and that if slavery were eliminated, then it would mean the end of Southern liberty. Another way to look at it also is that the Confederate States wanted to have the freedom to do as they liked. And this freedom was a freedom to preserve slavery. That's very clear from their ordinances of secession and the justifications for secession made at the time. So they did not want the North, particularly the Republican Party, to interfere with their freedom to hold African Americans in bondage. Now, in terms of Confederate objectives, the first one is to hold on to the de facto independence already gained. And their situation here is exactly the same as the revolutionaries during the War for American Independence. When the war broke out, the royal governors were quickly eliminated from power. The revolutionaries took control of all the colonial governments, eventually the state governments, and then it became a matter of preventing the British from reasserting control over these colonies, or later the states. The next objective was to continue the war long enough for the North to accept the permanent reality of an independent Confederate States of America. And this did not mean invading the North and conquering a peace or anything along those kinds of lines. It really meant defending themselves long enough for the Lincoln administration to do as the British government had done during the War for American Independence, which was to realize that a victory was impossible, and then an abandonment of the military struggle. In terms of Confederate strategy, their situation, again, was similar to the colonies in 1775 through 1783. Now, to some extent, the colonies, or the American states, adopted a conventional military approach by creating the Continental Army. But this Continental Army remained essentially a force in being. The most important thing was to make sure that this Continental Army was not defeated. And so the Continental Army never basically fought a decisive battle to control New York or Philadelphia or any other major city. And so, if necessary, it abandoned even Philadelphia, the capital where the Second Continental Congress met, to British control. So the main thing was to preserve the Continental Army to to maintain a force in the field. And so the Continental Army is a conventional force, but the strategy is not conventional in the sense of trying to hold territory. The Confederates, on the other hand, did opt for conventional defense in this way. They tried to control the territorial expanse of the Confederacy. Now, they could have adopted this revolutionary strategy, but they didn't. Why not? Well, here are the major reasons. First, there was a more even match with Union forces relative to the match between the revolutionaries and the British ground and naval forces. And so the possibility of a successful conventional defense was much higher. The second was that there were political pressures to defend every locality. And then also, the Continental Army during the American Revolution created a sense of legitimacy because a conventional army suggests greater legitimacy in a government than campaigns conducted largely through guerrilla warfare, regular warfare, whatever you want to call it. But also, and this is important, a conventional defense was least likely to disrupt the institution of slavery. Slavery depended upon order, law enforcement, and an ordered, stable society above everything else. And during the antebellum period, the southern states and southern localities had slave patrols, and they had other means that they utilized to maintain a very strong control over the enslaved population. They knew that if this control were shaken, even for a little bit, the resulting instability would allow hundreds, maybe thousands of African Americans to escape slavery and would undercut slavery, perhaps fatally. So conventional defense would help to maintain that order, that stability on which slavery depended. Now, the way in which the Confederate government decided to conduct this conventional defense was not through defensive warfare only. They had what they called an offensive defensive. And what this was the idea was that the Confederate High Command would, when a Union Army advanced, they would determine the main axis of advance and the objective of the enemy advance, and then they would concentrate their forces against it and counterattack. And this strategy really rested on two assumptions. The first was that the Union armies would not advance simultaneously, and they were right about this until 1864. Ulysses S. Grant, when he became the general in chief of the Union armies, was the first to really launch successfully a series of coordinated attacks that all jumped off at roughly the same time. The other thing that Confederate strategists were interested in. Hang on a second. Back up. I'm going to back up. Sorry, there was a. There we go. There was a slide that I thought was in there that isn't. Maybe it's later in the presentation. I'll have to fix this later, but right now I'm not going to worry about it. Well, what about the North's material advantages? And if you look at any American history textbook, you see that in terms of total population, in terms of wealth, factory production, every measure except the production of cotton and the number of free men that were available for military service, the Union had the edge. But most of the North's advantages were potential, not real, and it would require a kind of fiscal military revolution for the Union government to pay, factories for manufactured goods and to get the other wherewithal for war. So the Confederacy understood this. They also understood that enslaved Africans permitted a larger percentage of white manpower to enter military service. The North also had the task of projecting large armies deep into Southern territory. And The Confederacy, if you look at the distance between Richmond and Dallas, Texas, that's the same distance as between Paris and Moscow. So you're dealing, in European terms, this was a vast distance that the Union Army had to control. So a vast region, and one Confederate politician basically said that there was no power on earth that could defeat the Confederacy this large, as long as the Confederate population was true to itself, as he put it. And then the North was also going to have to deal with a hostile population. The Confederate policymakers assumed that white Southerners would oppose the Union armies, and by and large, they were correct. There was a substantial population of Southern Unionists, to be sure, but as it would turn out, most white Southerners did support the Confederacy, at least in the first 2 years of the conflict. Southern forces could also fight on the defensive. There's a rule of thumb among military men that it requires a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower for an attacker to overcome a defender. Now, here's the slide that I meant to get at earlier. Another reason for this was that the Confederates believed that they could exploit interior lines. And what's meant by an interior line is, if you look at this semicircle and you think about what it would take to get from Richmond, if you look over in Virginia, to Vicksburg at the left-hand terminus of this semicircle, you would see that if you could go directly from one place to the other, that they could do it quicker than the Union forces could accomplish in terms of trying to get from, say, Washington, D.C. to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, this strategy of interior lines was something that military analysts really believed in at the beginning of this war, and would continue to believe in. And there's a certain amount of truth in it. But one of the things that the Confederates failed to consider is that the key thing is not this geometry of it. It's the key thing is how fast forces can get from point A to point B. And by exploiting their advantages in sea power and exploiting their riverine advantages, in terms of the number of steamships and so forth steamboats that were available to them, and above all, exploiting the railroads, Northern armies could move actually more rapidly than the Confederates could, particularly since the Confederate railroad network was not as extensive as that in the North, and because the Confederate railroad network could not hold up under the strain of the war effort. The Union, in contrast, had the U.S. military railroads that did a very good job, both of reconstructing or renovating the Confederate rail network as Union armies moved into the South and needed to use those Confederate railroads, and they also even created new railroads to a limited extent when those were militarily necessary. So this interior lines idea, on which the Confederate government placed such great stress, was really this advantage was more illusory than real. Now, the Union, and thinking here about the objectives of the Lincoln administration specifically, were twofold at the beginning of the war. The first was to restore the Union, obviously, to eliminate the Confederate States of America, and to restore the Southern states into what Lincoln called their proper relationship to the United States. The second was to maintain a base of political support. And this was a major challenge that the Lincoln administration well understood from the outset of the conflict, and it would remain a major challenge for the entire war. Now, some Northerners, they're called peace Democrats, or if you want to use the term pejoratively, Copperheads, opposed the war outright. They really felt like Americans should not be killing Americans, and they viewed the whole war effort as tragically misguided, and the Lincoln administration was never going to get the support of these Northerners. Now, others supported the war, but only if white Southerners' constitutional rights were preserved. including the right to hold slaves. And these were what historians, not called legitimist Democrats. The term was not used at the time. What it meant were Democrats who saw themselves as kind of loyal opposition to the Lincoln administration and who saw themselves as preserving and protecting an older version of the Constitution that the Lincoln administration really found that it had to abandon, in which you're dealing with the need for due process, so that you could not simply take people's property away from them without without having a legal process involved with it. This would include resources like livestock and crops and so on. And then importantly, these legitimist Democrats believed that this constitutional right also included the right to hold slaves as property. Now, there were some who wanted a war to end slavery, and this was a vocal Republican minority. Some abolitionists and other anti-slavery Northerners who now decided that the price of retaining slavery was really too high, that slavery underpinned this Confederate States of America in terms of bringing the Confederates, the Confederacy into being in the first place. But also, and the Lincoln administration well understood this, is it had to hold the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland in particular, in order to prevent the Confederacy from becoming so large and have such a population and such an expanse of area and additional resources as to make the Union Army's ability to gain victory much more difficult, if not impossible. And then the third element of Lincoln's objectives during the war's first 18 months or so was to avoid attacking slavery and to pursue what was called a conciliatory policy. This is never conciliatory policy, in a formal sense. The Union never had something that they called the conciliatory policy in so many words, but everybody understood this policy, and people did talk a lot about conciliation. And the idea here was that there was a substantial, maybe a great majority of white Southerners who until recently had been loyal Americans and then had been sort of hoodwinked into secession by a minority of extremists. And that if you did move into the South and attack the Confederate armies, but reassure Southern civilians, hey, we're gonna take care of your property. Don't have to worry about that. We'll even guard your property. We're not going to touch slavery. If you have slavery, we'll keep them. We're not going to take your slaves away from you. Now, at the same time, though, if your slaves do escape, we're not going to return them to you either. But we're interested in restoring the Union, not in attacking slavery. So you can be reassured on that count. In terms of Union strategy, the general-in-chief of the Union Army at the beginning of the war was Winfield Scott, who was a veteran of the War of 1812, had been one of the better battlefield commanders of that conflict, had commanded the American Army during the major campaign, the one that went from the Gulf of Mexico, the port city of Veracruz, to Mexico City to do what Winfield Scott called conquer a peace. Scott carried that out in a brilliantly conducted offensive. So Winfield Scott was really quite something. But by the beginning of the American Civil War, he was also about 75 years old, and a year older than the Constitution, it was said. And he was plagued with vertigo and dropsy and gout. You don't really know what these things, these things are, except they ain't good. And so he had trouble. He couldn't mount a horse anymore. He could sort of, hobble around, but he remained sharp mentally. And so he came up with something that he didn't call the Anaconda Plan, but the newspapers did when they understood the essentials of it. And his first idea was you have to blockade the Confederacy. You have to prevent the Confederacy from getting outside supplies and support from the European powers. And this was actually something the Lincoln administration had not thought about carefully until Scott brought it to their attention. He also thought that you needed to gain control of the Mississippi River. So you'd send a strong column down the Mississippi River, control of that. And this would isolate the Confederacy further. And then you would wait. No further military advance. You would just wait. And you would wait for Southern Unionist sentiment to reassert themselves. Essentially, the first two steps were to show the ability of the Northern armies to squeeze the Confederacy. This is where the anaconda analogy comes from, because an anaconda snake kills its victims by squeezing them to death. But there's not going to be any actual squeezing done. Once this magisterial strategy unfolded, it would demonstrate to Southern whites that the Confederate government was really powerless. And also that the objective of the Lincoln administration was not to just destroy their country or take away their slaves or anything like that, but they had nothing to fear. So this Anaconda Plan was a major element in this conciliatory policy. And then, as I said, another part of the Union strategy was to secure or neutralize the border states. Really can't emphasize that point enough. Now, Lincoln did not agree with the third element of the Anaconda Plan. This idea of waiting, Lincoln thought, would enable the Confederate States government to remain in existence longer. And what he felt like is the longer it exists, the more white Southerners are going to see that government, not the United States government, but the Confederate government, as the one to which they would offer their allegiance. So this Confederate government would have legitimacy in a way that the Lincoln administration did not want. And so Lincoln preferred this quick victory. And so, much against Winfield Scott's advice, Lincoln obliged a Union army of 35,000 men near the vicinity of Washington. He obliged it to advance as early as July 1861. This is barely 3 months after the firing on Fort Sumter. And his basic idea was, hey, I know that this Union army of 35,000 men is not really well trained and so forth. I get that from General Scott. But the fact of the matter is the Confederate army, is slightly smaller, we think. And, those soldiers aren't very well trained either. And so, the Union Army's green, the Confederate Army's green, all these Union Confederate soldiers were all green alike. This is almost a direct quote from Lincoln. So he obliges this Union Army to advance, and the result is a spectacular defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run in July 1861. And this defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run serves notice that the war is going to be a good deal longer than many assumed it was going to be at the outset. Now, here's a map of the American Civil War, and I wish I could do the next slide in combination with this particular map, but I can't. And what I want you to notice, though, is that in what's called the Eastern Theater, which consisted mostly of Virginia and then subsequently Maryland and Southern Pennsylvania, this is where the bulk of Union military strength was concentrated. This is where the first battle of First Bull Run was fought. And then if you look at the box in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that a great many battles in the Civil War were fought in Virginia, not just during 1861, 62, but for the balance of the conflict. And if you look down at the bottom, you will see 3 arrows going in the direction of Richmond, Virginia, from the Chesapeake Bay. That's the Peninsula Campaign, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. If you look over in the area beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and we're talking about Tennessee, and then Alabama, and particularly Mississippi, this is called the Western Theater of the war. And you can see that you get a strong column driving down into Tennessee, and then also a force coming up from New Orleans and then going down the Mississippi River Um, and this is also important in terms of the main Union advances during 1862. Now, in terms of the early campaigns, what I want you to know is that after the Battle of First Bull Run, the war consists mainly of a war for the border states. Uh, the Union succeeded in securing Maryland immediately through arbitrary arrests and banishing the Maryland state government and doing other things that were sort of extra legal. The Kentucky and Missouri were under control by early 1862. The Lincoln administration pushed Confederate troops that were present to a limited extent in Kentucky, and they were also able to push the Confederate troops out of Missouri and into Arkansas. So the border states were secured by early 1862. Then there was a Union drive in the Western Theater to control the Mississippi River and also the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The Tennessee River was navigable all the way to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it cut down through northern Alabama, so you could get a long ways into the Confederacy by way of the Tennessee River, which is the tributary of the Ohio River. Then the Cumberland River um, went flowed through Nashville, the Confederate the capital of Tennessee. And when the North got control of the Cumberland River, this meant the capture of this important state capital. So, and success attends these early offensives. So you have the capture of Nashville, Tennessee in February 1862, the capture of New Orleans in April of 1862, the capture of Memphis, Tennessee in early June 1862. So the war looks at this point like it's going to end in an early Union victory, not an immediate victory, but still one that is going to occur presumably by mid 1862 or late 1862. Things look pretty good. The Confederates, in terms of this offensive defensive strategy, they see this Union drive up the Tennessee River, because the Tennessee River flows from south to north toward the Ohio River. So this Confederate column is driving up the Tennessee River, and there is an important landing, Pittsburgh Landing, close to a church called Shiloh Church, and the Confederates concentrated against the Union Army that was sort of gathering at this place called Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. They collected troops from all over the western part of the Confederacy, and they attacked in early April to drive this column back, or even to destroy the Union Army. This was a major example of this offensive defensive strategy. The Union looks like it's in big trouble during the first day of this 2-day battle, but Ulysses Grant, who was in command of the Union forces, didn't get panicked, got reinforcements in the evening, counterattacked the next day, and won this Battle of Shiloh. However, that having been said, more Americans died in the Battle of Shiloh than in all previous American wars combined. And so it's the Battle of Shiloh that really demonstrates to Northerners and Southerners alike that the destructiveness and the bloodiness of this Civil War that was underway was going to be a lot worse than anybody could imagine. Then you have George B. McClellan attempting what is called the Peninsula Campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. And this occurs from April to June, actually July 1st, and this looks too like it is going to end in a Union success, that McClellan is actually going to capture Richmond. He gets so close to Richmond at one point that the advanced Union forces can see the spires of the Richmond churches, not 5 miles away. This Peninsula Campaign also involves another concentration of Confederate troops to oppose it, and this results in a counteroffensive planned and executed by General Robert E. Lee that defeated McClellan defeated this Peninsula Campaign, defeated this first major and almost successful attempt to take Richmond, and generated a military stalemate whose end result nobody could foresee. And at this point, the Lincoln administration reconsidered its strategy. It abandoned the conciliatory policy and then made a decision, which we'll look at next week, on limited emancipation as a military necessity. And I'll stop sharing here. That's a pretty good introduction to the major, to the objectives, the grand strategy, and the course of the first 18 months of the conflict.